Sometimes the greatest hunger in a mansion has nothing to do with food. Nathaniel Brooks had built an empire by noticing the details everyone else ignored. Numbers. Expressions. Tiny inconsistencies hidden beneath polished presentations. It was the reason he had become one of the wealthiest men in America. Yet on the evening of his annual charity gala, surrounded by crystal chandeliers, white marble floors, and guests dressed in designer tuxedos and elegant evening gowns, he almost overlooked the one truth that mattered most. The Brooks estate shimmered beneath thousands of warm lights. Classical music drifted through the grand ballroom while servers carried silver trays topped with prime rib, lobster tails, artisan bread, and desserts crafted by celebrity chefs. Expensive perfume mixed with the rich aroma of roasted herbs and butter. Laughter floated through the air like carefully rehearsed music. It looked like generosity. It looked like perfection. Nathaniel smiled politely as investors praised his latest philanthropic campaign, but something felt strangely hollow. Excusing himself from another conversation about charitable donations, he slipped away from the ballroom. The silence beyond the grand hallway felt almost comforting after the endless applause. He loosened his tie slightly and wandered toward the service corridor, a place few of his distinguished guests would ever notice. The polished marble slowly gave way to plain tile floors. The music faded behind thick walls, replaced by the quiet hum of industrial refrigerators and the distant clatter of dishes being washed. It was another world hidden inside the same mansion. Then he heard it. Not footsteps. Not voices. The delicate sound of cardboard folding closed. Nathaniel stopped. A faint light spilled from the pantry door left slightly open. At first he assumed one of the kitchen staff was finishing cleanup after the event. Instead, he saw a little girl no older than 10 kneeling beside a recycling bin. Her pale blonde hair caught the soft fluorescent light like strands of winter sunlight. Her oversized sweater hung loosely over her small shoulders. In her hand she carefully arranged pieces of untouched dinner rolls, slices of turkey, and vegetables into a plain takeout container. Every movement was slow and careful, as though she feared even the food might disappear if she moved too quickly. She glanced over both shoulders before gently closing the lid. Only then did she quietly lift a small piece of bread, break it in half, and take the tiniest bite Nathaniel had ever seen. She didn't eat like a hungry child rushing through a meal. She ate like someone trying to make a single bite last forever. His heart tightened. She wasn't stealing jewelry. She wasn't making a mess. She wasn't looking for attention. She was hiding. Hiding because somewhere in her young life she had learned that being hungry was something to be ashamed of. Nathaniel remained perfectly still in the shadows, saying nothing. For the first time that evening, surrounded by a house overflowing with abundance, he felt the unbearable weight of something money alone could never explain. Nathaniel quietly stepped back before the little girl could notice him. He did not clear his throat. He did not switch on another light. He simply closed the pantry door as gently as he had found it, and returned toward the ballroom with slower footsteps than before. The orchestra was still playing. Crystal glasses still chimed together in cheerful celebration. A famous television host was praising the generosity of the Brooks Foundation, while photographers captured smiling guests beneath glittering chandeliers. Everything looked flawless, yet Nathaniel could no longer admire any of it. The image of the child carefully dividing a single dinner roll into 2 tiny pieces lingered in his mind more vividly than every expensive decoration surrounding him. Across the room, the catering staff continued working with quiet efficiency. Servers moved like invisible shadows, replacing empty trays before anyone noticed they were gone. Among them was Sarah Carter, a woman who wore the same simple navy housekeeping uniform she had worn for nearly 3 years. Her blonde hair was neatly tied into a modest bun. Her posture remained straight despite the exhaustion resting quietly behind her gentle blue eyes. She polished silver, collected dishes, and answered every request with the same respectful smile, never drawing attention to herself. Nathaniel suddenly realized he knew almost nothing about the woman who helped care for his home every week. He knew her employee number. He knew she had never arrived late. He knew every supervisor described her as dependable. But he had never once asked about the person behind the uniform. Sarah noticed him standing near the hallway and offered a polite smile before lowering her eyes again. She seemed relieved that the evening was progressing without problems. Every few minutes, however, her gaze drifted almost instinctively toward the service corridor before quickly returning to her work. It was the glance of a mother silently checking on someone she loved. Nathaniel followed the direction of her eyes without moving his head. The pantry door remained closed. The little girl stayed hidden behind it, exactly where she believed she belonged. He accepted another conversation with several business executives, but their voices sounded strangely distant. They discussed market trends, investment forecasts, and multimillion-dollar expansion plans. Nathaniel answered politely, yet every sentence felt empty beside the quiet truth unfolding only a few hundred feet away. One executive laughed while describing how much food had been ordered for the gala. Another joked that enough leftovers would remain to feed an entire neighborhood. The guests laughed together. Nathaniel did not. Later that evening, the final speeches ended and luxury cars began leaving the circular driveway one after another. Staff members immediately shifted into cleanup mode. Decorations disappeared almost as quickly as they had appeared. Fresh flowers were gathered. Linen tablecloths were folded. Silverware was counted with practiced precision. Nathaniel remained in his study overlooking the back gardens, watching the workers through tall windows instead of reviewing financial reports as he usually did after every event. Near midnight, Sarah finally removed her work gloves and quietly entered the employee locker room. A few minutes later, she emerged wearing an inexpensive gray coat that had clearly seen many winters. Beside her walked Emily, carrying the same plain cardboard container against her chest as though it contained something priceless. Sarah smiled warmly when she noticed it. She gently brushed a loose strand of blonde hair away from her daughter's face and whispered something that made Emily smile back despite her obvious fatigue. Then, almost without thinking, Sarah reached for the container. Emily quickly pulled it away and shook her head with a determined little smile. Nathaniel could not hear the words through the thick glass, but he understood the gesture immediately. The little girl had not been saving the food for herself. She had been saving it for her mother. The drive home was quiet. Sarah steered her aging sedan through nearly empty streets while the lights of downtown faded behind them like another universe. Emily sat in the passenger's seat hugging the cardboard container against her coat, smiling every time the aroma of warm bread escaped through the tiny opening in the lid. Their apartment building stood on the edge of an older neighborhood where cracked sidewalks and faded brick walls told stories no tourist ever came to hear. The elevator had been broken for months, so they climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs together. Sarah unlocked the small apartment and switched on a single lamp beside the worn sofa. The room was clean but modest. The furniture had been repaired so many times that every scratch seemed to carry its own memory. A tiny kitchen occupied one corner, and a second-hand dining table stood beside a window overlooking a parking lot instead of a skyline. Emily carefully placed the container in the middle of the table as though it were a holiday feast. Sarah smiled gently. "Sweetheart, you should have eaten more at work," she said softly while hanging her coat near the door. Emily quickly shook her head. "I already did, Mom. I was full." It was a convincing answer, except for the way her stomach quietly protested a second later. Sarah pretended not to notice. Instead, she opened the container and divided every piece into 2 equal portions with remarkable precision. One dinner roll became 2 halves. One slice of turkey became 2 smaller slices. Even the vegetables were separated as evenly as possible. Emily watched carefully before smiling. "You take the bigger one," she whispered. Sarah laughed gently and pushed the larger portion back toward her daughter. "I had dinner during the gala." It was not true. Emily knew it immediately because her mother never had time to sit during large events. They exchanged the same harmless lie they had shared dozens of evenings before. Each wanted the other to believe they had already eaten enough. Finally, they silently agreed to split everything exactly in half. It was not a perfect meal, but somehow it became enough because they shared it together. Meanwhile, several miles away, Nathaniel Brooks remained awake long after midnight. His study overlooked acres of perfectly maintained gardens illuminated by elegant landscaped lighting. Shelves filled with awards, photographs, and business achievements surrounded him, yet none of them held his attention. Instead, he opened the digital personnel records for Brooks' estate. Sarah Carter. Housekeeping Department. 3 years of flawless performance evaluations. No disciplinary reports. No complaints. Perfect attendance except for 2 unpaid days taken after a severe winter storm. Nathaniel continued reading. Widow. No immediate family listed. 1 dependent child. Emily Carter. He leaned back slowly. There was almost nothing else. A human life reduced to a handful of administrative facts. He pressed the intercom on his desk. His longtime executive assistant, Margaret Ellis, answered despite the late hour. "I am sorry to disturb you," Nathaniel said quietly, "but tomorrow morning I would like complete information about our employee assistance program. I want to know how many people have requested help during the past 5 years, how many requests were approved, and how many were denied." Margaret hesitated for only a moment. "Of course, Mr. Brooks. Is something wrong?" Nathaniel looked out toward the dark gardens where fountains continued flowing beneath the moonlight. "I am beginning to think," he answered slowly, "that I have spent years believing I understood the people who work in this house, when the truth is I have barely seen them at all." The next morning the Brooks estate awakened with its usual rhythm. Gardeners trimmed perfect hedges before sunrise. Delivery trucks arrived with fresh flowers, premium groceries, and polished silver waiting for another evening of entertaining. Every detail reflected order, precision, and prosperity. Yet for Nathaniel Brooks, the mansion no longer looked the same. Every spotless hallway reminded him of the quiet pantry where a little girl had believed she needed to hide just to eat. Margaret Ellis entered his study carrying a neatly organized folder instead of her usual tablet. She placed it gently on his desk. "Everything you requested is here," she said. Nathaniel opened the file and slowly turned the pages. The Employee Assistance Fund had existed for years, but the numbers immediately caught his attention. More than half of the requests had been denied because they did not meet outdated qualification rules. Medical emergencies, housing assistance, childcare support, temporary transportation. Every page contained people he had never truly seen. Then he found Sarah Carter's name. She had never submitted a single request. "Why not?" Nathaniel quietly asked. Margaret adjusted her glasses before answering. According to her supervisor, she never wanted special treatment. She always said someone else probably needed the help more than she did. Nathaniel stared at the sentence for several long seconds. He had spent decades rewarding confidence, negotiation, and ambition. Yet the employee carrying the heaviest burden had remained completely silent. Later that afternoon he decided to walk through the estate without announcing himself. Staff members greeted him politely as they continued their work. Some appeared surprised to see him outside the executive offices. Nathaniel noticed things that had escaped him for years. The housekeepers ate lunch in less than 20 minutes before returning to work. Maintenance workers quietly repaired equipment that guests never realized existed. Kitchen staff stood for hours preparing meals they rarely had time to enjoy themselves. Near the laundry room he saw Sarah folding freshly pressed table linens with the same careful attention she gave every assignment. Emily sat nearby with a library book resting on her lap. She was completely silent, turning each page with remarkable care so she would not disturb anyone. Every few minutes she looked toward her mother with quiet admiration, smiling whenever Sarah glanced back. Nathaniel remained hidden behind the corner long enough to hear another employee approach Sarah. "You really should ask Mr. Brooks for help," the woman whispered kindly. "Everyone knows your rent keeps going up." Sarah smiled politely but shook her head. "I have a job. I have my daughter. We are still together. That already makes us luckier than many people." The other employee sighed. "But you are working yourself to exhaustion." Sarah folded another tablecloth before answering. "Emily is watching everything I do. If she grows up believing difficult seasons can only be faced with bitterness, then I will have failed her. I would rather she remember that kindness costs nothing, even on the hardest days." Nathaniel felt those words settle heavily in his heart. He had expected frustration. He had expected resentment. Instead, he found quiet dignity stronger than pride. Before leaving the hallway, he noticed Emily carefully removing a small apple from her backpack. She looked around to make certain her mother was busy, then gently placed the fruit beside Sarah's water bottle without saying a single word. Moments later, Sarah found it and smiled, believing her daughter had already eaten one herself. Emily simply lowered her eyes and returned to reading. Once again, each of them silently chose the other before themselves, never realizing that this time someone had witnessed the truth from beginning to end. The following morning, Nathaniel canceled 2 investment meetings that had been scheduled for weeks. His board assumed another acquisition had demanded his attention, but the truth was far simpler. For the first time in years, he wanted to understand the people whose quiet work kept his world running every single day. Instead of remaining behind the polished doors of the executive wing, he walked through the service areas before sunrise. The estate looked completely different before the guests arrived. The marble floors were still beautiful, but now they echoed with the sound of rolling supply carts instead of expensive shoes. Fresh coffee drifted through the employee break room while bakers prepared bread long before anyone in the mansion would wake up to enjoy it. Nathaniel stood unnoticed for several minutes, watching conversations that no executive report could ever capture. One groundskeeper quietly admitted he had postponed replacing the tires on his truck because his daughter needed new glasses. Another employee laughed while saying he had become an expert at stretching leftovers into 3 different meals. Nobody complained loudly. Nobody demanded sympathy. They simply adapted because they believed they had no other choice. Nathaniel realized that prosperity often looked very different depending on which entrance someone used to enter the same building. Later that afternoon, he reviewed security footage from the previous month, not because he suspected wrongdoing, but because he wanted to understand the routines inside his own home. He found Emily appearing only a handful of times. She always remained exactly where her mother instructed her to sit. Sometimes she quietly read library books. Sometimes she colored pictures with short pencils worn nearly to the eraser. Sometimes she simply watched birds through the kitchen window while waiting for Sarah to finish another long shift. Nathaniel noticed something else. Every evening, after the staff meal had ended and before cleanup was complete, Emily carefully waited until everyone else had finished before collecting whatever untouched food would otherwise be discarded. She never reached for anything first. She never interrupted anyone. She accepted only what nobody wanted. There was no greed in her actions, only quiet gratitude. He continued watching. On one recording, Sarah finally noticed the small container in Emily's hands. She smiled warmly and asked, "Is that enough for tomorrow's lunch?" Emily nodded with bright confidence, even though Nathaniel knew the answer was not entirely true. Another recording showed Emily slipping half of a sandwich into her mother's work bag while Sarah was cleaning nearby. Hours later, Sarah discovered it and smiled to herself, believing her daughter had somehow forgotten it. Neither one ever admitted they were secretly trying to feed the other. Nathaniel slowly closed the final video. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts across 3 continents, but nothing had prepared him for 2 people loving each other so completely that both were willing to stay hungry rather than let the other go without. That evening he invited the estate manager, the director of human resources, and Margaret Ellis into his study. They expected another discussion about budgets. Instead, Nathaniel asked a question that left the room completely silent. "How much food do we throw away after every large event?" The estate manager looked surprised before answering. "Several £100 on average, sir. We donate what we legally can, but a significant amount still has to be discarded because of food safety regulations." Nathaniel folded his hands together. "And how many employees leave this estate wondering what they will serve their families for dinner?" No one answered. They could not. The silence itself became the answer. Nathaniel looked out the window as the evening sun settled behind the gardens. The mansion still stood as a symbol of extraordinary success, yet for the first time he understood that true leadership was not measured by how perfectly a house was maintained. It was measured by whether the people who cared for that house felt seen, valued, and protected. In that quiet moment he made a decision that would soon change far more than one little girl's life. The following evening the estate prepared for a smaller private dinner attended by several longtime business partners. The atmosphere felt calmer than the charity gala, yet the mansion still glowed with effortless elegance. Candles flickered across polished oak tables. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. The scent of freshly baked rosemary bread floated from the kitchen, while chefs quietly finished each course with practiced precision. Nathaniel moved through the house, greeting his guests with the same calm confidence they had always admired, but his attention never wandered far from the service hall. He was waiting, not for an investor or a celebrity, but for the quiet truth he now knew often revealed itself after everyone else stopped paying attention. As the evening came to an end, the guests gradually departed beneath the warm glow of the front entrance lights. Staff members immediately began clearing plates and stacking serving trays. Nathaniel remained in his study with the lights turned off, his office door slightly open toward the hallway. Nearly 30 minutes later he heard the gentle footsteps he had come to recognize. Emily walked carefully into the service pantry carrying her familiar cardboard container. She looked around, believing she was alone. Nathaniel quietly followed at a respectful distance but did not reveal himself. Before she reached the shelves holding the untouched dinner rolls, another sound stopped them both. Sarah entered through the opposite doorway carrying a basket of folded kitchen towels. She froze the moment she saw her daughter. Emily's smile disappeared. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. Finally Sarah walked closer and knelt until they were face to face. "Sweetheart," she whispered gently, "why are you doing this again?" Emily lowered her eyes toward the floor. She held the container tightly against her sweater, as though afraid it might be taken away. "Because you are always tired," she answered in a voice barely louder than a breath. "When you come home you always say you already ate here. But I know you do not have time." Sarah's lips trembled with a quiet smile that could not completely hide her sadness. She gently touched Emily's cheek. "My precious girl, I only say that because I want you to eat." Emily looked back at her mother with tearful blue eyes that still carried remarkable innocence. "And I only say this because I want you to eat." The pantry fell completely silent. Neither realized another person stood only a few feet away beyond the partially open door. Sarah slowly wrapped her arms around her daughter. "You should never have to worry about taking care of me," she whispered. Emily leaned against her mother's shoulder. "But you always take care of me." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment before softly laughing through the emotion in her voice. "We make quite a pair, do not we?" Emily nodded. "We both keep pretending we are full." Sarah smiled sadly. "Yes. We do." Nathaniel felt something shift deep inside him. During his entire career he had witnessed negotiations worth billions of dollars, speeches that moved stock markets, and celebrations of remarkable success. None of those moments carried the quiet power of the conversation unfolding before him now. There was no anger in this room. No accusation. No bitterness. Only two people loving each other so deeply that each willingly accepted discomfort to spare the other from it. Nathaniel quietly stepped away before either of them noticed his presence. As he walked back through the dark hallway, every decision he had made over the previous week suddenly became crystal clear. He understood now that charity alone would never solve what he had witnessed. Temporary generosity could fill a table for one night. Genuine responsibility could change generations. By the time he reached his study, he was no longer asking himself whether he should act. He was already planning exactly how every family working under his roof would wake up to a different future. The next morning every department manager received an unexpected message requesting their presence in the main conference room at exactly 9 o'clock. Rumors spread quietly through the estate before sunrise. Some employees worried about budget cuts. Others feared another restructuring after the expensive charity season. Sarah arrived a few minutes early, smoothing the sleeves of her neatly pressed navy uniform while wondering whether she had accidentally made a mistake she had not yet discovered. Emily sat in the employee lounge with a library book borrowed from her elementary school, happily reading while waiting for her mother to finish the meeting. Inside the conference room, Nathaniel Brooks stood at the head of the long walnut table without the usual stack of financial reports. Instead, a single folder rested in front of him. His expression was calm, but there was a quiet conviction in his eyes that immediately captured everyone's attention. When the final manager took a seat, Nathaniel began speaking. For many years I believed that providing employment was enough. I believed fair wages alone fulfilled my responsibility. I have recently learned that I was mistaken. The room became perfectly still. Nathaniel continued. A successful business is not measured only by its profits. It is measured by the well-being of the people whose hard work makes those profits possible. Several managers exchanged uncertain glances. They had never heard him begin a meeting this way before. Nathaniel opened the folder. Effective immediately, every full-time employee of Brooks Estate will receive a substantial salary increase. Every family will receive comprehensive medical insurance with no employee premium. We are establishing an emergency assistance fund that can be approved within 24 hours for housing, transportation, or unexpected family needs. Every child of every employee will qualify for an educational scholarship through the Brooks Family Foundation. Beginning today, every staff member may take home fresh meals prepared daily by our kitchen. Food that is safe and wholesome should nourish families, not fill dumpsters. No one spoke. The announcements came too quickly to process. Nathaniel looked around the room before adding one final sentence. These are not gifts. They are long overdue responsibilities. Margaret quietly distributed printed copies of the new policies while several department heads stared at the pages in disbelief. One supervisor slowly raised his hand. Sir, this will cost the estate millions of dollars every year. Nathaniel nodded without hesitation. Yes, it will. I have spent decades investing in buildings, technology, and expansion. It is time I invested with the same confidence in people. The meeting ended without applause because everyone remained too stunned to react. Within an hour, the news had traveled through every hallway, kitchen, workshop, and maintenance office on the property. Employees gathered in small groups, reading the official announcement again and again, searching for hidden conditions that did not exist. Sarah accepted her copy with trembling hands. She read every line twice before quietly sitting in the break room. Her eyes filled with tears she had spent years teaching herself not to shed at work. The medical insurance alone would remove burdens she had carried in silence for years. The scholarship meant Emily could dream about college without first worrying about money. The meal program meant no parent would have to wonder whether dinner would be enough. She pressed the paper gently against her chest and whispered a grateful prayer that no one else could hear. Down the hallway, Emily looked up from her book as her mother entered the lounge. Sarah smiled through tears and knelt beside her daughter. Without saying a word, she wrapped Emily in the warmest embrace she had given her in a very long time. Emily looked surprised before smiling back. What happened, Mom? She asked softly. Sarah brushed a strand of blonde hair behind her daughter's ear and answered with quiet wonder. I think someone finally decided to see the people who have been invisible for far too long. 3 weeks passed, and the Brooks estate felt different in ways that could not be measured by financial reports or business forecasts. The hallways still gleamed beneath polished chandeliers. The gardens still bloomed with perfect rows of roses. Elegant dinners still welcomed influential guests from across the country. Yet beneath the familiar beauty, something far more meaningful had quietly taken root. The employee dining room, once nearly empty because everyone rushed through short breaks, now echoed with genuine conversation and laughter. Fresh meals were prepared every day, and no one felt embarrassed about taking food home for their families. The cardboard containers that once represented quiet survival had become symbols of simple dignity instead of silent sacrifice. Sarah no longer counted every dollar before walking into a grocery store. For the first time in years, she bought fresh fruit without calculating what she would have to put back on the shelf. She replaced Emily's worn sneakers with a new pair. that actually fit her growing feet. She even framed Emily's latest school certificate and proudly hung it beside the kitchen table, where both of them could see it every morning. Emily changed too, although not in the way many people expected. She remained polite, gentle, and grateful. She still greeted every employee by name and thanked the kitchen staff whenever they packed meals for the families. But the uncertainty that had once lingered behind her bright blue eyes slowly disappeared. She laughed more often. She carried herself a little taller. She no longer looked over her shoulder before accepting a meal because she no longer believed kindness always came with conditions. One Friday evening the estate hosted another formal gathering. Once again luxury cars lined the circular driveway, and guests admired the grand architecture while servers moved gracefully through the ballroom. As the dinner concluded, Nathaniel stood near the entrance greeting departing visitors when he noticed Emily waiting quietly beside her mother. Sarah had finished her shift and was preparing to leave, but Emily had stopped to admire a grand piano standing beneath the sweeping staircase. She was not touching it. She simply smiled at its polished surface as though appreciating something beautiful from a respectful distance. Nathaniel walked toward them with an expression so calm that Sarah immediately became nervous. "Mr. Brooks," she said softly, "I hope everything was satisfactory this evening." Nathaniel smiled warmly. "Everything was excellent, Sarah. In fact, I would like to ask both of you for a small favor." Emily looked up with quiet curiosity. Nathaniel extended his hand toward the ballroom where the final dinner table remained beautifully arranged beneath sparkling candlelight. "Would you join me for dessert?" Sarah immediately shook her head. "Sir, we could never." Nathaniel gently interrupted her. "Tonight you are not joining as employees. You are joining as my guests." The room had nearly emptied, but several staff members quietly paused when they noticed what was happening. Nathaniel personally pulled out a chair for Emily before inviting Sarah to sit beside her. The same table that had once seemed reserved only for wealth and influence now welcomed the two people who had spent years serving everyone else. A chef soon arrived carrying warm apple pie with vanilla ice cream prepared only minutes earlier. Emily looked at the plate with wide eyes before glancing toward her mother for permission. Sarah nodded through grateful tears. Nathaniel watched the little girl enjoy her dessert without hurry, without fear, and without trying to save half of it for later. Then he smiled gently and spoke the words that neither Sarah nor Emily would ever forget. "A child should never believe that she belongs behind a pantry door when there is a place waiting for her at the table. As long as I have the privilege of leading this home, there will always be a chair here for both of you." 1 year later the Brooks estate was still known for its elegant gardens, remarkable architecture, and distinguished guests, but those who worked there spoke about something far more important. They spoke about a place where people finally felt seen. New employees often noticed the atmosphere before they understood the reason behind it. Supervisors greeted housekeepers by name. Managers regularly shared meals with kitchen staff. Families attended seasonal celebrations together instead of hearing about them afterward. The estate had not simply changed its policies. It had changed its culture. The Brooks Family Foundation Scholarship welcomed its first group of students that autumn, and among them was Emily Carter. She walked through the doors of her new school carrying a backpack filled with brand new notebooks instead of quiet worries. Her teachers quickly noticed her curiosity, her kindness, and her habit of helping classmates who struggled before anyone asked her to. Every afternoon she hurried home excited to tell Sarah about another science experiment, another library book, or another dream she had begun to believe was finally possible. Sarah's life changed in quieter ways that mattered just as much. She no longer worked endless overtime simply to keep the lights on. She had enough time to attend school events, cook dinner with Emily, and occasionally enjoy peaceful evenings that had once seemed impossible. The constant weight she had carried for years slowly disappeared from her shoulders. Friends who had not seen her in months often remarked that she looked younger, not because time had reversed, but because hope had returned. Nathaniel Brooks also changed, though few business magazines ever wrote about it. His companies continued to grow, but he rarely spoke about quarterly profits during interviews anymore. Instead, He often reminded young entrepreneurs that every successful organization was built by people whose names might never appear on the front page of a newspaper. He quietly expanded the employee assistance program across every Brooks property in the country. Other executives initially questioned the additional expense, yet within a year employee retention improved, productivity increased, and the companies earned a reputation for treating workers with uncommon respect. Investors called it a brilliant business decision. Nathaniel knew it had begun as something much simpler. One evening, as another charity gala came to an end, Nathaniel wandered once again toward the familiar pantry where everything had changed. The shelves were neatly organized. Fresh meals waited in clearly labeled containers for employees to take home after their shifts. No one needed to hide. No one needed to wonder whether there would be enough. As he quietly looked around the room, he heard light footsteps behind him. Emily stood in the doorway, now a little taller than before, holding a handwritten thank you card decorated with small blue flowers she had carefully drawn herself. She handed it to Nathaniel with a warm smile. Inside were only a few simple words. "Thank you for seeing us." Nathaniel closed the card slowly and felt his eyes soften. After all the awards he had received and every achievement celebrated throughout his career, those 4 words meant more than any trophy resting inside his office. Some people believe the world changes through extraordinary miracles. Sometimes it does. But more often it changes because one person chooses to notice what everyone else has learned to overlook. A child should never have to hide to eat. A parent should never have to choose between dignity and survival. And true wealth is never measured by the size of a mansion or the balance of a bank account. It is measured by the number of lives made brighter because someone with the power to help finally decided to open not only a door, but also a heart. In the end, the most unforgettable legacy Nathaniel Brooks ever built was not the estate that carried his name. It was the table where no child would ever again wonder whether there was a place waiting for her.